Europe, May 1945. The war that would not end. The guns had been going for 5 years, 8 months and 6 days. In all that time there had been no silence. Not complete silence. Even the pauses between artillery barrages carried something. The creak of a broken shutter, the distant cry of someone who had stopped screaming hours before but whose echo still moved through the rubble. By the spring of 1945, the people of Europe had forgotten what silence felt like. They had stopped expecting it. And then, on the morning of May 7, 1945, in a red brick schoolhouse in Reims, France, a German general named Alfred Jodl sat down at a table and placed his name on a document that was supposed to end all of it. The act took less than 5 minutes. The scratching of a pen. The press of a stamp. Flashbulbs from photographers who had crowded into the room. Afterward, Jodl stood and asked permission to speak. He said, in a voice that carried no emotion, that the German people and the German military had achieved and suffered more than perhaps any other people in the world. He hoped the victors would treat them with generosity. No one in the room responded. The document called for all German forces to cease combat operations at 23:01 Central European Time on May 8, 1945. That was roughly 40 hours away. 40 more hours of legal war. What happened inside those 40 hours, and in the days that followed, is a story history has long preferred to skip past. It fits no clean narrative of triumph. It is a story about thousands of men who continued to fight and die after the moment that was supposed to make all further dying meaningless. Some did not know the war was over. Some knew and could not stop. Some chose to keep going because stopping felt, in its own way, like a different kind of surrender. This is not a story about victory. It is a story about the day when victory itself came too late to mean anything at all. To understand what May 8, 1945 was actually like, you have to understand the geography of collapse. By the final weeks of April, the German state had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning entity. Hitler was dead in a bunker beneath Berlin. Communications between German command structures had deteriorated to the point that many field commanders were receiving orders by radio from superiors who did not know where those commanders were, or how many men they still had, or whether the roads on their maps still existed. The Allied advance had fractured the German military into dozens of isolated pockets, each one fighting a slightly different war, each one cut off from accurate information about the others. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were still pressing forward through Czechoslovakia and Austria. Along the Elbe, American and Soviet troops had linked up and were holding position. In Italy, German forces had surrendered on May 2. On the Courland Peninsula on the Baltic coast, approximately 200,000 German soldiers had been trapped since the autumn of 1944. They had withstood 6 major Soviet offensives. Their commander, General Karl Hilpert, received news of the Reims surrender by radio on May 8. He did not immediately order his men to lay down their weapons. He sent messages to the rump German government under Admiral Donitz and asked for clarification. The replies were slow. His men kept their positions. And in Czechoslovakia, in the cities of Prague and Brno, along the roads running through the Bohemian countryside toward the American lines in the west, something was still burning. Prague had been on fire in its own way since May 5, 1945. That was the day the citizens of the city rose against the German occupation force. The uprising had been spontaneous in the way that only desperate things are, not without planning, but beyond any plan's control once it started. Czech resistance fighters and ordinary civilians had erected barricades in the streets, seized radio stations, and broadcast calls for help in every direction. They fought with rifles and homemade weapons against German SS troops who had received no instructions to show mercy. What the Czech insurgents had hoped was that American forces would race east from their positions in Pilsen and liberate Prague. General George Patton, whose Third Army held those positions, wanted to do exactly that. He believed his forces could reach Prague in hours. He was ordered not to advance. The decision came from General Eisenhower, following prior agreements with the Soviet Union that established which forces would liberate which territories. Prague was in the Soviet zone. American forces would hold the Pilsen line. The Czechs in Prague would wait for the Red Army, which was still days away. In those days, people died in Prague streets by the hundreds. The men in the most desperate position of all were perhaps those who had been soldiers for so long they had forgotten how to be anything else. Consider a German infantryman, the composite of a dozen real accounts, who had been at war since September 1939. He had fought in Poland. He had gone east in 1941 with the certainty that the campaign would last 3 months. It had lasted nearly 4 years and had taken everything he recognized about the world. By May 1945, this man did not fight because he believed in National Socialism. He had stopped believing in that somewhere in the winter of 1941. He fought because fighting was what he knew how to do, and because the men beside him were the only constant left in a world that had dismantled every other constant. He had learned to treat their survival as a purpose. It was not ideological. It was more primitive than that. When the surrender news reached units like his, through fragmentary radio broadcasts, through white flags appearing in the distance, through an officer who gathered his men and spoke quietly, the reaction was rarely what civilians might have expected. There was no rejoicing. There was something more like the absence of something. A weight that had been present so long it had become structural, and whose removal left men not lighter but uncertain about what was holding them up. Some units received the news and immediately complied. They stacked their weapons. They waited. Others kept moving. At 23:01 Central European Time on May 8, 1945, the official ceasefire came into effect. The moment passed like any other moment in a country that had lost the ability to mark time by anything other than the sounds of explosions. In some places there was silence at the appointed hour, a silence that people would describe for the rest of their lives as the strangest thing they had ever heard. In other places the guns continued. In Czechoslovakia they continued for several more days. The Red Army's advance toward Prague was not a leisurely movement. Soviet forces under Marshal Konev drove hard toward the city, in part to secure the political reality of Soviet liberation before anything else could intervene. Along the roads they traveled, German units were still present, some surrendering as Soviet columns rolled past, some fighting simply because their officers had not yet given the order to stop. The dying that occurred in this window was real dying. It was dying with consequences. For families who would wait, for letters that would never arrive, for graves dug in foreign soil without markers. It was not symbolic dying. It was not dying that served a military purpose, because the military purpose had been extinguished with Jodl's signature in Reims. It was dying that the war produced out of its own momentum, the way a flywheel keeps spinning after the engine that drove it has been switched off. On May 9, in the village of Slivice in Bohemia, a German force of several thousand men, a mixed group that included SS units, Wehrmacht remnants and foreign volunteers, made a final stand against Czech insurgents and approaching Soviet forces. They had been attempting to break through to the American lines and had been blocked. Some fought out of conviction. Some fought because they believed, accurately, that surrender to Soviet forces was unlikely to result in the treatment prescribed by the Geneva Convention, given what their units had done in the years prior. The fighting at Slivice lasted through the morning. By afternoon it was over. Hundreds were dead. It was May 9, 1945. The war in Europe had officially ended the previous night. The primary reason many German units kept moving on May 8 and the days following was not ideology. It was geography. The soldiers on the ground understood something the document signed in Reims did not fully address. Surrender to American or British forces meant prisoner of war camps, a difficult existence but a survivable one with a reasonable expectation of eventually going home. Surrender to Soviet forces for soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front carried a different weight. The war in the East had been conducted with a ferocity that had made enemies of entire populations. These soldiers had been through villages they were not proud of. They carried knowledge of things that had happened in places they had passed through. And so from across Czechoslovakia, from pockets in Austria and along the Danube, from the Courland Peninsula and the Baltic, the movement began. Not an advance. A migration. Hundreds of thousands of men attempting to cross the line, get west, get to the Americans, get to the British, before the ceasefire created a hard boundary the Soviets would enforce. Some made it. Some did not. In Prague, the day of liberation arrived with the rumble of Soviet tank columns on the morning of May 9. The city that greeted them had been fighting for 4 days. Its streets were barricaded with cobblestones and overturned trams. Its buildings were pocked with bullet holes. Its citizens were exhausted and wildly, desperately joyful in the way people are joyful when relief is so enormous it has no ordinary form. They climbed onto the Soviet tanks. They wept. They gave soldiers whatever they had, bread, wine, flowers pulled from damaged gardens. The German occupation of Prague, which had begun in March 1939, was over. But in the hills and forests outside the city, the fighting was not finished. Small German units continued moving through May 9 and into May 10 and May 11. Some dissolved, men throwing away their weapons and insignia, attempting to melt into the civilian population. Some pockets held out until Soviet forces systematically eliminated them, engagement by engagement, through countryside that had nominally been at peace for days. The last organized German resistance in Czechoslovakia was not extinguished until May 12, 1945, 4 days after the official end of the war. On the Courland Peninsula, General Hilpert had received the surrender order. He had verified it. He had assembled his senior officers. On May 9 he broadcast a message to his forces. He told them the war was over. He told them to lay down their weapons and surrender to Soviet forces in an orderly manner. He told them they had served Germany with honor. He told them to trust that the laws of war would govern their treatment. He knew, as he said it, that the last part was uncertain. Most of those 200,000 men did not return to Germany for years. Some did not return for decades. Some did not return at all. General Hilpert was taken prisoner by Soviet forces. He died in captivity in 1947. He was 50 years old. History has never settled on a number. Historians who have attempted to count the casualties of the final days, from May 8 through the complete cessation of organized resistance, arrive at estimates that vary considerably. What is certain is that people died. On May 9, on May 10, On May 11th, in Czechoslovakia and Austria and the Baltic states and in small forgotten pockets of resistance that the tide of history had isolated and left behind, they died for nothing that any general staff would have entered in a ledger as a military objective. The terrain they fought over had no strategic value. The outcomes of their individual engagements changed nothing about the shape of the post-war world, which had already been decided in conference rooms by men wearing suits. The bridges they defended or attacked would carry the same traffic the next morning regardless of who held them. This is what made the dying of those days different from the dying at Normandy or Courland, where the outcome was genuinely in question. This dying was an aftermath, a mechanical continuation, a war running on its own stored energy with the intention removed. The last German soldier officially recognized as killed in action in World War II in Europe died on May 8, 1945, the day of the official ceasefire. His name was George Gardner. He was 19 years old. He died in Czechoslovakia. There are no dramatic accounts of his final hours. He did not leave letters preserved in archives. He is known through the official records that noted his death, brief lines in a document that processed thousands of similar entries. What those lines do not capture is what it meant to be 19 years old on May 8, 1945, still holding a rifle in a country that was not his own, still being asked to do something that no one above him had yet acknowledged was finished. He was not unique. He was representative. He stood for the final bracket of a generation that the war had consumed so completely that many of them never had the chance to become anything other than soldiers. On the American side, the death that has received the most historical attention is that of Charles Havlat, a private from Nebraska, killed by a German sniper on May 7, 1945, the day the surrender document was signed in Reims, hours before news of the signing had reached the front. He was 22 years old. He had a photograph in his pocket taken 2 weeks earlier in which he was smiling. His family did not learn of his death until after the celebrations in the United States had already begun. In towns across America, people were already dancing in the streets, already ringing church bells, already tasting the first moments of a peace that felt unambiguous and complete. In a house in Nebraska, a family waited for a door to open and for someone to hand them an envelope, and in the gap between those two Americas, the one celebrating and the one not yet informed, there is something that history has never been entirely comfortable looking at directly. Because the questions it raises have no satisfying answers. Why was Charles Havlat in front of a German position on May 7, 1945? Why was anyone? The war had, by any rational assessment, been decided for months. The formal administrative structures of the post-war world were already taking shape. None of that had stopped a sniper in a broken building from taking aim at a young man from Nebraska who had crossed an ocean to be there. A young American soldier from Ohio, whose name appears in a letter held by the National Archives, wrote to his mother on May 9, 1945. He wrote, "They told us it was over. We thought it was over. I don't know what to tell you except that it is not over where I am standing. He survived the war. He came home. The letter came home before he did." The exact moment when the shooting stopped completely in Europe cannot be given a single date. On the Western Front and in northern Germany, compliance with the ceasefire was largely immediate. British and American officers supervised the disarmament of German units with a brisk efficiency that suggested both sides were relieved to be doing something predictable. German soldiers stacked their weapons. Allied soldiers pointed them toward holding areas and watched them go. The machinery of war shifted, with remarkably little friction, into the machinery of occupation. In the East it took longer. The last recognized engagement between organized German forces and the Red Army occurred on May 11, 1945, near the town of Milowitz in Czechoslovakia. The German unit involved was attempting to break through to the American lines. They did not succeed. By the time it was over, most of the German soldiers were dead or captured. May 11, 1945. 3 days after the official end of the war. No ceremony marked this moment. No photographs were taken. No generals were present. The men involved were, most of them, too exhausted or too relieved or too grief-stricken to register that what had just ended was a specific and particular thing, the last organized military combat of the Second World War in Europe. They were just soldiers in a clearing or soldiers who weren't anymore. The soldiers who survived those final days carried the particular burden of men who had seen the end of something. There is a quality specific to the end of a long war that is different from the end of any other ordeal. The men who had fought since 1939 had spent so long inside the logic of war that peace arrived not as relief but as a kind of disorientation. What does a soldier do on the morning after the last morning of a war? He does not know what to do with his hands. He has learned, through years of brutal conditioning, to narrow his awareness to the immediate. The man beside him, the ground ahead, the sound that might be incoming or might be nothing. The skill of living beyond that narrow frame had to be relearned, slowly, by men who had used it so rarely for so long that it felt unfamiliar. Some never fully made that transition. The war did not simply stop for the men who had been inside it. It continued in their dreams and in their silences and in the particular way they sometimes left a room when the conversation turned to certain subjects. For the families waiting in Germany, May 1945 was the beginning of a different kind of uncertainty. The German military's postal system had collapsed in the war's final weeks. Millions of families had last received word from their soldiers months, in some cases years, earlier. The ceasefire did not immediately produce information about who had survived and where they were. For some families the waiting lasted months. For some years. For some, the families of men who had died in the final days, in the final hours, on the final morning, the waiting ended with a notification letter that arrived into a world that had already moved on. These letters reached houses half destroyed and rebuilt with other people's materials. They reached people who had moved and moved again. They reached families that had been holding, through sheer stubbornness, to the possibility that the wait would end differently. Some families never received notification at all. The men simply did not return and were never explained. What war leaves when it is over is not only the ruins are visible and they can be cleared. Not only the graves are marked and they can be visited. What war leaves that cannot be cleaned up or visited is the accumulation of absent futures. The people who were not born because someone died too early. The knowledge that was never passed on. The conversations that never happened between a father and a son, a wife and a husband, a woman and the brother who did not come home. The Second World War produced these absences at a scale that remains, 80 years later, almost impossible to fully apprehend. Numbers do not grieve. Numbers do not wait by a window in the evening watching the road. In the small hours of May 8, 1945, after the ceasefire came into effect but before the celebrations had fully died down, somewhere in Central Europe, in a farm building or a ruined house or a foxhole in a wood, a soldier lay down. He had been awake for most of the past 4 days. He was cold. He was hungry. His boots were wrong for the season and his feet had not been dry in 2 weeks. Somewhere inside the machinery of his exhausted body, the fact of the ceasefire had been processed, but it had not yet become real in the way that things become real only after sleep. He closed his eyes. The shooting had stopped mostly. In the distance there was still something that might have been gunfire, or might have been the sound of the night settling into its own sounds now that the larger sound was gone. He did not know yet what had been won or lost or merely survived. He did not know what the silence growing around him would eventually become, whether it would fill with ordinary life, with ordinary mornings, with the smell of bread and the sound of children. He did not know if he would be permitted to return to those things, or if what was coming was something different and harder. He slept. Outside, in the dark over a continent that had spent 6 years dismantling itself, the light that precedes the dawn was gathering, the way it always does, without announcement, without asking whether anyone was ready. The day would come whether anyone wanted it or not. It always does. The last organized German military resistance in Europe ended on May 11, 1945, 3 days after the official ceasefire. Historians estimate that between 50,000 and 100,000 soldiers died in combat in the days surrounding the formal surrender. The exact number has never been and likely cannot be precisely determined. The names of most of those soldiers are preserved in national military archives. The futures they did not live are not recorded anywhere.